Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, this event is a recording of one of our Thursday garden chats, which happen at 6 o'clock London time every Thursday evening. This is a pro bono event, which we started doing in April 2020 during the first lockdown. Our aim is to talk to interesting and entertaining garden people. They could be gardeners, they could be amateur growers, they could be designers or botanists. And we talk to people from all over, from the Americas, from the Southern Hemisphere, from Asia. We like to think that we bring you the cutting edge of horticulture and our engagement with plants. So all of these recordings go on to our YouTube channel and eventually move on to our website. And the best ones are for members only. Our membership entitles you to access to premium material, to a forum, to keep in touch with other members and perhaps seek or offer information, and various discounts and special invitation-only events. Or, if you like, you can just keep in touch by signing up for our monthly email newsletter. So all of this is explained on our website, gardenmasterclass.org. So here's hoping you will enjoy this recording, and hoping perhaps you'll come and join us, or at least keep in touch.
So lovely. So I'm going to hand over to Noel, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Annie. Well, our speaker tonight, our guest tonight is Michael Marriott, who is a name probably many of you know. And Michael is a rosarian, and that noun itself is rather unique because I can't think of any other plants that have their own particular noun, and they're aren't arbutulinarians or dahliarians or whatever one I think of.
Originarians.
Yes. This goes to illustrate, of course, just how central roses are to Western garden culture, and to Islamic garden culture too. I shall never forget coming across some rather nice English roses growing very high up on the near the Pakistan-China border on the Karakoram Highway. And
no, they wouldn't be English roses. They would be Pakistani roses.
Were English roses probably bred by our speaker's fair hand.
Did they have labels on them?
I recognise them, Annie. Pakistan has a very thriving rose growing culture and a rose society, and Michael's probably designed gardens there. Anyway, so Michael is a rosarian. He didn't turn to roses initially, though. He started off, could we say, in a more sort of functionalist area as an agricultural botanist, didn't you?
Yes, I studied agricultural botany at university, coming from a farming background, and being absolutely passionate and fascinated by plants and gardens from a very early age. As soon as I saw the course at university for agricultural botany, I thought, that's it, that's the course I want to do. And yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. So it was not all that practical at all, really, the university course, but it had a good chunk of sort of pure botany in it, which I absolutely loved. So yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it sort of extended to 6 years altogether, being a student, which I think is a very good way to start off your sort of professional career, or a post-school career, I think, is to spend as long as possible being a student. Because
and was that at Cirencester or
no, Reading?
Reading, okay.
They do proper botany at Reading.
Yeah, so I think it used to. I don't know if they do anymore, actually.
No, I'm not sure they do. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's yes, I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Fantastic.
So when did you get seduced by roses?
Not until quite late, really, because after university, I took a year or two off, sort of messing around for a bit, and then because I'd taken a year off during university working for CDC, the Commonwealth Development Corporation in Swaziland, I applied back to them and said, would they like to take me on again? And amazingly, they said yes. So they sent me to the South Pacific. And so first of all to Sabah, which is on the northeastern corner of Borneo, growing rubber and cocoa. And then to the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, and then to Papua New Guinea. And so that was 5 years of it was wonderful, because the plants, of course, out there were just completely different to what I'm used to over here. So it was Sabah, especially around there, Mount Kinabalu is a great centre of origin of many plants. So you see a lot of Musa species and a huge number of ferns and orchids and
Varroa rhododendrons, which I've always had a real...
Yes, I don't think I realised about them when I was there. But we actually nearly got to the top of Mount Kinabalu. But then you sort of thing where you go up nearly to the top, you stay the night in a cabin, and then you go and see dawn from the top the next morning. Unfortunately, when we woke up, it was absolutely torrential rain, and Mount Kinabalu being a great big lump of granite, it just sort of torrential rain off the top. So unfortunately, I had to give that up. But and when I was at Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, I had chances to go out to the other islands as well. So that was very good. But when I came back from the UK, I got a job, a not very satisfactory job, at a bedding plant and rose nursery in St Albans, near St Albans, and then lucky enough to get the job at David Austin. So the only experience really I had of roses before that in my grandparents' garden in Warwickshire, where they had the classic sort of rose beds where there was sort of half a dozen really miserable looking roses planted far too far apart. So acres of bare soil, and
yes, we know the sort of thing. Yes,
roses with no leaves and maybe a few odd red flowers on top. Roses. I love every other plant, but the roses didn't
appeal. Interesting. So when you joined David Austin, what was David Austin actually doing in terms of plant production or breeding?
Well, I joined in '85, and so that was exactly the right time, because the rose Graham Thomas had been introduced in '83, just a couple of years before. And that was the rose that really made David Austin famous, not only in the UK, but around the world, really.
Yes. So it was an incredibly successful rose. I remember Annie was talking about Willerton Old Hall earlier, and that Willerton was, I think, probably might have been the third garden I wrote about, and I've written about so many gardens over the years. We've, needless to say, exchanged a lot of views on roses and the success or otherwise of David Austin roses. But so many times people have said to me, after some sort of rant or other, or whining and moaning about certain rose varieties, but they always say, "Oh, but Graham Stuart Thomas, oh, what a fantastic rose!" A truly fantastic plant.
Yes, and I wasn't there at Chelsea when it was introduced, but apparently, people heard about it. The journalists wrote about it, and everybody wanted to go along to Chelsea and see this wonderful new rose, and also learn about David Austin. And so you can imagine the other rose breeders, sort of Jack Harkness, getting thoroughly sick of being asked, "So where's Graham Thomas? Where's David Austin roses?" In those days, it was a tiny little stand, up in the top corner somewhere, where all the weird and wonderful nurseries had their
interesting corner.
Yes, absolutely. So that was my first, and then my eyes opened about how wonderful roses were, because they're so diverse and so versatile as well. It was really exciting to go up there, and David Austin, as one might expect for somebody who's so passionate about a subject, he could be quite difficult sometimes to work with, and his mind was just totally focused on the breeding, really. I think the nursery was a means to an end of being able to breed his roses. So, if I had an idea, because I started off work there as the nursery manager, and I spent most of my time actually working out in the field. There was only, 10 people employed by him at that time altogether. So I spent most of my time actually outside in the field working alongside everybody else.
Yeah.
And you know, I had in my mind, okay, we're going to go and do a certain job in the production field, but if you wanted something done on the breeding side, I just had to say, okay.
Yes.
I could battle against it sometimes. It wasn't worth it. You know? No, I wanted that done.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, it was obviously, the idea of the English Roses was clearly an idea waiting to happen, and he stayed with that. But who was initially his intended market for the English Roses?
Anybody who'd buy them.
Well, what I'm getting at is, was he aiming at a British market, or was he aiming?
Oh yes. I mean, I think the thought of sending abroad was in those days, because the nursery started in '69, so the thought of sending roses abroad in the '70s and early '80s was completely, and even well into the '80s.
Yes.
I can't remember when the first foreign catalogue was produced, but it must have been late '80s or early '90s. I mean, because you could see then that sending anything abroad in plants especially was actually quite easy, and it's very sad now that we can't, that can't be done. I was at a show in Italy recently and was totally frustrated that I couldn't bring any plants back. And people would say, take this time, take this time.
Backward step. Yet another price of Brexit.
Yeah, so that was very, very frustrating for me. So yeah, it was very much at the rose enthusiast, I suppose, and for many years the nursery struggled like mad, and I think 2-3 times he was on the verge of giving up. Just the sales didn't add up, and but his wife was very supported him hugely, so he was able to just about by various means, which maybe best not to go into, to survive. And people used to say, "Oh, your marketing is absolutely brilliant," and he'd get very cross at that, because it's not marketing; it's the roses, the beauty of the roses that people want. And I don't know if you saw the little piece I wrote in the Garden magazine, June edition.
Oh yes.
And where people are asked about words of wisdom, and I got from him that what people should have when people are producing roses, any plants really, is that magical character of beauty and charm. He used to use the word charm quite a lot, and I get rather cross when I see plants being introduced on the basis of novelty alone. Novelty is of no value, really, to my mind. What we want in our garden is beautiful plants and charming plants, and I very much got that from David Austin. I think it's such an important character to have in your plants.
And Michael, what is it? What do you think the allure of the rose is? Because it is one of those. It's always the sort of the nation's favourite plant. Yeah. What is it? Is it just the scent? Is it what is it that that people do get so? It's such a romantic notion about roses.
Yeah.
Have you got a theory?
Well, I think it's a combination of a whole lot of all the characters, really. Scent is certainly very, very important. And I mean, the good question to ask, why did it first become important? I mean, it's not just important in cultures in the UK, it's all around Europe, and Middle East, Far East, North Africa, everybody, Chinese absolutely, and it's actually evidence that the Chinese started growing them before we did over here in the West. And so
they never really became very important in Chinese garden culture. In China, there's a certain enormous range of other things. Their role was sort of relatively minor. I think the Chinese have got more interested more recently, to be honest.
Yes, but they still did regard them as an important part of their culture, and they did grow them. So yes, next to chrysanthemums and peonies and things like that, not so
Yes,
much,
yes.
but they still regard them. So I think it's a different. It's a question I've asked myself several times. I think fragrance is important. And actually, the thought I had the other day was, I don't know, it's because I'm a bit biased because I know roses so well. I think roses are very recognizable.
Yes.
And there's some plants which, if you're not too careful, you can easily poison yourself or kill yourself very badly. The umbellifers, things like carrots and things like that. And then you've got hemlocks, which are not too dissimilar. And you get that wrong, and then you end up with, you end up at 6 foot under sort of thing. But I think roses are incredibly recognizable. And of course, that's important if you're creating some sort of potion for cure. And it's long been held as the rose is curing everything. If you're keen on this sort of subject, then read Jenny Potter's book called Roses, and it's full of absolutely fascinating facts. And there was one chap who listed all the things that roses could cure. I mean, every single ailment that you could think of, whether it's mental or physical. Oh yes, the rose will cure that, no problem at all. And of course, it's been very important in the Roman times and ancient Egyptians for their festivities and their banquets and their orgies and things like that. There's probably this apocryphal story, this painting where supposedly people at the banquets were drowned because so many petals were dropped from the ceiling. And Cleopatra had a cubit depth of petals scattered on the floor of her boat so that she could seduce old Mark Antony. And then, of course, it's not just in that side of it. It's regarded. It's a great symbol for beauty, and then there's in religion. It's a symbol for the Virgin Mary. In the legal system, you have the sub rosa, where anything if you say something under the rose in the ceiling, then you're not allowed to divulge it to anybody else. And political world, the Labour Party and quite a few other similar parties around the world have the red rose as their symbol. So it's actually, you see it everywhere. I mean, I think there's hardly a day goes by where you might not consciously see the rose, but it's there practically everywhere. And we were looking at our garden. I know we've got quite a few roses in our garden, but I think you look around gardens, and at this time of year especially, I think a lot of the colour in the garden comes from roses. It's
I mean, that recurrent or long flowering habit is very unusual amongst woody shrubs, and when it first occurred with roses, which I suppose is on 19th century, that must have been an enormous boost for the genus as a whole.
Yes, and it's got to the extent now which I get very cross about, is people reject any roses that flower only once.
I know, yes.
So even though a once flowering rose might flower for 5 or 6 weeks, they say, oh no, I want a repeat flowering rose. And then they still happily plant peonies and lilacs which flower for about a week.
I also wonder, Michael, whether it's partly to do with the fact that it's almost impossible to kill a rose.
Well, yes, a lot of the old roses are incredibly tough. And I went today to Abbey House Gardens, where he had a collection of 2,000, and it's been sadly neglected for the last few years, and these poor little roses still struggling to, they're right under alströmerias and overgrown yew and things like that, and still struggling to survive. But yes, they are incredibly tough, and of course, things like Officinalis and Alba Maxima and Alba Semiplena. They've been around for centuries, and Quatre Saisons, maybe have known in Roman times. That's how they managed to get their petals completely out of season. Quatre Saisons, which is the only repeat flowering Western variety before the Chinese roses came.
And also, I can't think of other flowers that we, you know, I really can't think of other flowers that where we touch the petal, like we throw rose petals, and they're very tactile, they're very velvety. I mean, you know, I can't think of other flowers that we use in that way, and that we actually interact with rather than just look at, which so there's a sensual quality to that as well, isn't there?
There's that ceremony in a Muslim shrine, a Sufi shrine, you know, in Pakistan or northern India or somewhere, and you buy these baskets of rose petals, and you're not allowed to sniff them. If you smell them, you're taking away the essence, and you go into the shrine and you throw them over the saint's shrine. It's a wonderful. A wonderful thing to do. To sort of pull back to your career, so can you talk us through the process of breeding a new rose variety? It's a bit of a sort of black box for a lot of people, I think.
It's absolutely dead easy. I mean, and that's how roses are still bred today. Is just you get a knife. You harvest the stamens before they release the pollen. That's important, because if they've already released the pollen, then you might get self-pollination. So that's like, so you get a sharp knife, and just sort of carefully harvest the stamens, put them in a little glass jar, put it in a warm place overnight so the pollen can be released from that, and then you just get an ordinary little paintbrush, dab it inside, get a bit of pollen on the end of it, and then you would just apply the pollen to the stigma of the flower that had been emasculated in a similar way, and that's it. You know, just dab it on carefully, and you don't have to worry about protecting it from other insects, because once you take off the petals and the stamens and things like that, so roses are exceptional. Bees and insects go there only for the pollen. There's no nectar in roses. They only go there to harvest the stamens. So once the stamens are gone, they're sort of reject them out of hand. And then hopefully the hip will swell, it'll get fertilization, the hip will change color, and then when it's sort of more or less fully ripe, you cut the hips off, cut the seeds out, keep them at about sort of 1 or 2 centigrade for about 3 months, and then you can sow them, and then with a bit of luck you'll get some germination. Some varieties cross incredibly well, some are very reluctant to cross, but most roses are fairly happy to cross. Well, the difficult ones are the very, very double ones, you know, with hardly any stamens in the middle, and very difficult to access the stigma in the middle. So if you want to start off easy ones, start off with the singles and semi-doubles, and then so that in the spring the seeds will germinate, and you can plant that. So if you've crossed 2 repeat flowering roses, then you'll get actually flowers in that first year. So from seed. Seedling, you'll get flowers that very first year, which is very exciting. Otherwise, you have to wait 2-3 years or something like that.
And in commercial production, how long before a new variety can be, you know, sold? I mean, how long do you have to give it?
It's usually at least 10 years, because you've got to think that you've got to. One of the basic things is you've got to multiply the plants up from that initial one plant, because you know, if you get well on the scale we did it at David Austin's, they were doing something like getting something like 300,000 seeds a year to get about 150,000 seedlings, and every single one of those 150,000 seedlings was genetically unique. And so you've got to choose the ones that you think are good. And then you've got to multiply it up from that one plant up to however many you think you need to commercially introduce it. For Austin, that was sort of 20 or 30,000 or something like that. So that obviously takes a bit of time, but you also got to just make sure it's really reliable. So one year it might look fantastic, and the next year it looks absolutely awful. So obviously, if it does that, then you chuck it out. It's been very, very wasteful way of doing it, but you know, you've got to be sure that it's a really beautiful.
And you make it sound quite haphazard, but I mean, what I mean, most plant breeding involves a lot of very careful targeting of varieties to use, and increasingly, more complex genetics. I mean, how much of that was involved at David Austin?
Certainly, the parents were chosen very carefully, yes. And so there were parents that were very popular and knew that they were likely to get good results from them. And then there's also always ones, well, that looks like an interesting parent, or that's an interesting seedling. It's not quite good enough for introduction, but it's got some very useful traits. We'll introduce that into the breeding program. And so there was some which were there all the time and produced lots of wonderful seedlings, and others which were there just 2 or 3 plants just to try them out and see what happens. Yes, and then of course, because it was on such a large scale, computers were brought in to tell you. So every stage of the thing, that how many hips were formed from the crosses, how many seeds germinated, how many were selected at the first stage, second stage, third stage, fourth stage, and so on. And then that's where the computer comes into it to sort of help you identify those good parents.
And taking a step back from that, Michael, in terms of planning ahead, would you sit around, a table and think, we need a softer, we're lacking a soft yellow, or we need a bright pink, or we need a double red? How would you plan the crosses? I mean, because as Noel said, it sounded a bit like, oh, that's nice and that's nice, but did you sort of sit down and think, oh, the market is really lacking this and this?
No, not really, because it's such a, because it's 10 years from doing the cross to introduction. If you started doing that, the market would have changed by then. So you want a range of colours and forms and things like that. And that's the other thing that people often think of the English roses, the David Austin varieties, being very double. But in fact, he loved all types of roses. So, he loved the singles. So we got Totterine Bigently introduced a few years ago. And then he loved the semi-doubles as well. So things like Scarborough Fair, semi-double. And then short ones, tall ones, the climbers, ramblers. So, and I think that's one of the secrets of his success is not only did he, a rose could be, it could be have the most beautiful flower, have a fantastic fragrance, gets no disease at all. But if it didn't have that beauty and charm character, then it would be rejected. But also he wanted variety, so he didn't want all of them, and that's where the hybrid teas, to a certain extent, shot themselves in the foot, if you like. Is that they ended up being all very, very similar, except for colour. And I am exaggerating. But if you look at many hybrid teas, they have a very similar shape of plant and bloom, and so it all gets a bit tedious after time, really.
Yeah. And I mean, are there, in your own garden, do you know how many varieties of roses have you got? I mean, have you even got an idea, or is it just? Well,
funnily enough, they're coming to do some, Austin's sending a photographer across to do some photography in our garden on Monday. So they asked what varieties I had, so I said, I'll make a list, and I was quite surprised actually. So I think there's. I think total it was about 51, something like that. Right.
Wow.
So some of them are just English roses, and some of them are some really weird and wonderful ones that I've acquired over the years. So our garden is split into two. So his and hers, because we're both passionate gardeners and we have different ideas about how to garden. So actually, in Rosie, my partner's. Part of the garden, there's lots of English roses, and in mine, because I like, I really love the wild roses and interesting things. So there's quite a few wild roses there, and stripy Scots Rose a couple of years ago, which is I've never seen that before. So,
and I'm now intrigued of how you divide. Have you literally divided the garden down the middle, or are there?
Oh no, just different areas.
Right. Okay. I've got this idea.
His and hers. Yes.
A fence.
Yes.
No, and so the other person is allowed to advise, but only do work without plant anything with permission.
Yes.
In terms of the the gene pool David Austin Roses have been using, I mean, how far flung is that gene pool in terms of perhaps bringing in some sort of recondite old varieties or species, bringing a species into the gene pool which may have particular characteristics, I think particularly sort of environmental disease tolerances, or indeed attractive foliage, or some other more kind of far-flung reason.
Yes. I mean, he did bring a few species into the breeding program. They are difficult to work with because they are, of course, so different to normal roses. But actually, surprisingly, it didn't take too many. I think sort of 3 or 4 generations or something like that, and you had something that looked very sort of English rose-like. You could still see that there was something slightly odd about it. Not in a bad way, but it's always interesting. And then things like the Scots Roses, he introduced those into the breeding program. The Scots Roses, hybrids of Rosa spinosissima.
Yeah, and they're incredibly tough things. Again, talking about Pakistan, up in the Hunza Valley, I mean, basically in a high altitude desert. And the only plant, once you get out of the cultivation, the only things you see growing are tamarisk, perovskia, Clematis orientalis, note everybody, Clematis orientalis will cope with the most extreme conditions, and Rosa spinosissima.
Oh, really? Up there?
And Hippophae rhamnoides.
All right,
That'll sort of, you just see them growing around the edges of the oasis.
And then, of course, Rosa rugosa. That featured quite a lot in the breeding program as well. Yes, and I was lucky enough to go to Japan a few years ago and went up to the island of Hokkaido, which is right up north.
Right,
and it's very cold in winter. And off the northern coast of Hokkaido is this island of Ribbon, which is the popular name of it is the flower island. And there right on the edge of the cliff, right by the sea, was Rosa rugosa growing, literally about 6 inches high. And next to it was a dianthus, which is quite a lot taller than it. And in our garden, you could quite easily go to 6 foot tall. So, and that grows North Korea, around the coast of North Korea, Siberia, Northern China. So super, super cold and really tough conditions. And so that's a very good rose to introduce into the breeding program.
And of course, scent has always been a major issue, and I think the so many of the roses put on the market now, not just by David Austin but by everybody, do stress scent, because it was like almost felt like a couple of decades when, in the opinion of a lot of members of the public or garden commentators, that it was one of these cliches, roses had lost their scent. I remember wading through the biography of, I think it was Harry Wheatcroft, and researching my plant breeding book, and he launches into this in a very sort of grumpy manner. So it's simply not true. But we all knew it was. And I remember, now you worked actually with a scent specialist, didn't you?
Yes. I had this dreadful job. I mean, a lovely man called Robert Calkin. And I had this awful job of having to spend the whole day walking around smelling roses with him. So it's one of the tougher parts of my job at David.
Yes.
But he was wonderful. He'd give it a sniff, and then he sort of immediately identified what sort of fragrance it. It wasn't just the basic old rose or tea rose or something like that. It was all the different nuances as well. And the fascinating thing about roses is that actually, second to the tropical epiphytic orchids, there's another plant that has such a wide range of completely different fragrance types as the rose. So there's the 5 basic.
You say that, because I have this very powerful memory of being in Roberto Bulli Marx's greenhouses in Rio with his collection of Cattleya orchids. And I was just blown away by just how totally different they all smelled. It was just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the figures now, but it's something like orchids make use of, I think it's about over 1,000 different oils, potentially used, whereas roses are, I think it's 400 or 500 or something like that, and then the next one down is quite low. So you've got these very different sorts, and 5 basic sorts. You've got the old rose fragrance, the tea, the myrrh, a whole range of different fruity fragrances, and the musky fragrance. And so it's a crucial part of a rose is that fragrance. As I said earlier on, I think that's maybe why, although the species roses you see didn't, what's very important, people very quickly found out that you could extract rose oil from roses. And that was an absolutely crucial part of it. So that's been around for a very, very long time, for thousands of years. And so that was highly regarded rose oil. And today, of course, it's incredibly expensive to get the true rose oil. And all the top perfumes, like Chanel and things like that, they have a little smidgen of rose oil in there to make it something really special. So and I always say to people, smelling a rose has this magical ability to calm you down, but at the same time raise your spirits. And so when you smell a rose, don't just give it a quick sniff, but give it a good long snort and try and appreciate what's there. And it doesn't matter if you can't identify it, just appreciate what's there. It's wonderful. And always plant the most fragrant roses close to the path. It's no good if they're tucked away at the back of the border. Have them close to the path, so that any time you pass, you can give it a jolly good sniff.
We've got a question actually from Tanya asking you, Michael, what's your favourite rose for shade?
Favourite rose?
Favourite rose for shade.
For shade. There's quite a good little story there. We're both great believers in breaking the rules. I mean, rules in gardening are there for breaking, really. And sometimes they don't work, and sometimes they do. But plants are eminently movable. So if it doesn't work, you can easily dig it up and move it somewhere else or whatever. So Rosie said she'd like to plant some the rose Kew Gardens, which has got single white flowers, under our 100-year-old Bramley apple tree. And I said, oh, no, won't work. So of course she did plant them, and planted, I think, 4. And they're not as free flowered as if they were out in the full sun, but actually they look beautiful and just right under where they are, along with campion and things like that. Yeah. And so that's one that immediately comes to mind. It's a very, very healthy, very tough reliable. It's got no thorns, which is some people think is important. And does very, very well.
And you mentioned about moving roses, and I know I've heard Simon White talk about moving roses, and to if you move them, to take some soil with them. What's your thought on moving roses? Is it?
Yeah, roses are amazing how easy it is to move them. So even ones that are sort of 30, 40 years old can be moved successfully. So as long as you can dig up a few roots, good chance that they'll survive. To chop the top down to sort of 50 centimeters, 12 inches or something like that.
Even on a really old established rose.
Yeah. Because if you've got too much leaf, then it'll stress it. So and actually, it's a very good way sometimes. Roses that are sulking or not just growing well for whatever reason, it's a very good way of rejuvenating them, and sometimes they'll just perk back into life. Maybe the soil around where they were growing is totally worn out, and also people are very reluctant to prune roses often, prune them hard enough, and so a jolly good hard chop back down to sort of 12 inches or even harder, 6 inches, can often rejuvenate a rose very, very nicely, actually.
And I guess the moving best done in the winter, I would have thought.
So from October through to February, March, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Now Anna has got a long message or a long question here saying, how about selecting for pest and disease resistance? I came across argumentation, quite reasonable, that choosing resistant rose pushes, I think, resistant roses pushes pathogen coevolution into even more aggressive. As a consequence, the older, less resistant varieties cannot be used anymore. Have you witnessed this problem in real life?
I think it's a very common problem in all plants, isn't it? I mean, you breed lettuces which are resistant to botrytis or whatever, and then a new strain of botrytis comes along and wins over. And black spot, yes, I mean, roses might be, a certain variety might be resistant to a certain strain of black spot, but it won't be resistant to another strain, and quite a few new strains have come along. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? You can't win. You know, it's so I don't know what the answer is there. I think you just got to keep on trying to breed resistance and just accept. I mean, some of them don't get it. Some of the old varieties, Gallicas and things like that. I mean, they've been around for centuries and still pretty good. And the other thing is to actually just accept a bit of disease. I mean, people are obsessed with black spot, especially. You know, I think if you asked a whole bunch of 100 gardeners, you know, what disease can you think of in a garden? 98 of them would say, oh, black spot. That would be the first one that comes to their mind. And then they see a black spot on the leaf. Oh God, you know, I've got black spot.
It's like the end of the world. I know.
But don't worry about it, you know. And I've in the 40 odd years that I've grown roses, I've never sprayed any of them at all. I've never felt the need for them. And for disease, for pests as well, there is starting a bit of a interest in trying to breed for pest resistance. But actually, I think a few aphids on your roses and any plant is good. You know, you should. I think I say this jokingly that garden centres should be able to buy aphids, infect your plants, and so that attracts in your beneficial insects and the birds. You know,
they can then fend off a bigger invasion, almost like a vaccination. Yes.
And what about feeding regimes? Because we're all told that roses are hungry and and hungry feeders. So what's your sort of, do you feed your roses, or are you on a very nice heavy clay soil, or what's your sort of regime for feeding?
We've got lovely soil in the garden, and so if I remember, I'll give them a bit of food. Yes, I think the repeat flowers do benefit from the important thing is not to overfeed. You know, if it says apply 30 grams of fertilizer per rose, then apply 30 grams. You know, measure that 30 grams out, and don't think, oh, that rose is not doing very well, I'll give it a bit more. So you can easily be doing more harm than good. And roses, you know, sorry.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a long history of gardeners over fertilizing. We've had a very good series of presentations by a horticulture professor from Washington State, Linda Chalker Scott. And one of the things that came across really strongly from her was phosphorus toxicity. They get so much phosphorus in the soil from overfeeding that it then begins to lock up other nutrients.
Absolutely.
And I must admit, I'd never really heard of it before, but there's clearly potentially quite an issue.
Well, Gabrielle is asking, would you make up a seaweed solution as a foliar feed? Do you think that's a good thing to do?
Yeah, seaweed is great. I mean, we should be eating lots of seaweed as well.
Yeah, Japanese, yes,
absolutely. Seaweed is the best thing out. You know, it's fantastic stuff.
Yes,
I mean, it's all down if you can be bothered to do it, really. And as I said, I've never sprayed anything, you know, whether it's a fungicide or a foliar feed on my roses at all. I go for try and choose varieties that are tough, naturally tough and disease resistant, and I mix them up. The important thing is I mix them up with, or I should say we, because Rosie's just come home, so she'll be listening to what I'm saying.
Yeah, she'll be chipping in a minute.
We mix them up. We don't have a rose garden at all. We mix them up with other plants, so you know, it's not a monoculture in any way. Monocultures are the worst. We all know how dreadful monocultures are in anything, any species. So the thing is to mix them up with other plants in the garden, and if a bit of disease comes, then it gets hidden. But if something misbehaves itself too badly, out it goes. You know, it goes on the bonfire.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in terms of combining roses with other plants, I mean, we're thinking of, well, not not necessarily perennials, I suppose, but
No, not at all.
what are your favourite companions for roses?
Anything with blue flowers always works very well.
Yes.
Because of course there's no true blue roses, so things like salvias.
And long may that situation continue. Yes.
Yes. So salvias and campanula, delphiniums, nepeta, of course, and things like nepeta are very attractive to beneficial insects.
Yeah.
One of my very favorite, and people go on about perennials, but in fact biennials and annuals.
Yes.
I mean, there's lots of horrible annuals out there, but there are some very beautiful ones.
Yes.
Cosmos is rather lovely, but my favorite one of the annuals, which I go on and on about all the time, is Phacelia tanacitifolia.
Oh right, yes.
Which has been grown for a very long time as a ground cover plant. It's a member of the borage family, and it's incredibly attractive to bees and a whole lot of other insects. It's dead easy to grow, flowers within a few 2-3 months.
Quite a short season though, isn't there?
Well, you can keep on resowing it, and so once you've got it in the ground,
climate, yes,
keep on appearing, and if it gets a bit out of hand, then it's the easiest thing to pull up. It's a great thing to add to your compost heap. So Phacelia, it starts with PHA.
Yes, it's a good genus as a Western American annual. Blues, yes. Question actually from Lorenzo, who is in northern Italy. Is there an English rose I can grow in sun in the Mediterranean climate? The sun usually cooks all the blossoms of my roses as they open.
Yeah, the ones to avoid are the red ones or dark coloured ones. So, I mean, a lot of them you see on Instagram, people from really hot climates growing roses. So, I mean, I saw recently James Austin, which is actually a deep pink that's doing very well, and even some of the things like the Generous Gardener and I think Queen of Sweden, things like that. They all do very well. Roses are they as long as they're grown in that climate, they for the season, they cope very well. What we have in this country is that it's so variable, isn't it? So it's blazing hot one day and rain the other day. So if it's overcast and rainy for a few days and then suddenly get hot weather, they also they droop quite badly.
And a heavy downpour and all the
getting mildew and yes.
And so, Michael, if you could only, you had to pack up and leave, and you could only take 5 roses with you, you had to quickly snatch them out of the garden. What would they be instinctively? That top 5? Can you?
Well, there's what I'm looking out of the window now, and looking at one of my very, very favourite roses. It's Adelaide d'Orléans, which is a rambler, and it's got semi-double, medium-sized white flowers, and it doesn't have much of a fragrance. It doesn't set hips. And doesn't have much, it doesn't have to set it, but it's just the most beautiful rose you can imagine, so you don't have to have fragrance in it. Got incredibly lax growth, so it's just very, very beautiful rose.
Can you just say the name again? It's Adelaide
d'Orléans.
d'Orléans, okay,
As in
Orléans, yeah. Okay.
Gosh, what's the other ones? Munstead Wood is always very beautiful, really dark red flowers. Lady of Shalott. Lovely apricot orange flowers. Munstead Wood's got the most gorgeous fragrance, and Lady Shot's got not such a strong fragrance, but a very delicious fragrance, and it goes on flowering it starts in May and it'll go right through until Christmas, till having a go at Christmas time. Some of the species, I love the species roses. So I've got one in the garden here, which is called Hedliensis, which is very rarely seen, unfortunately, because it's very difficult to propagate. Basically, you need to dig up a sucker to be able to propagate it. It's got soft yellow flowers, so I love all of those.
What was that name again?
Hedliensis.
Hedliensis.
It's not a true species; it's a hybrid, but it's very species-like.
Interesting. And we got a couple more questions. So we've all raved about Graham Stuart Thomas, but Lynn, who's in Southwest US, says the blossoms droop quite a lot. Is this just a characteristic of this variety, or any suggestions?
Yeah, so it's Graham is not ideally suited to the hotter climates. I remember when it was first introduced and first went over to the States and over to Australia, you know, we would say, oh, it's a lovely 4 foot by 4 foot bush.
Yes.
And then people in Mediterranean type climates will say, oh, it's grown to 10 foot. And it's only in one season. So yes, quite a few roses do travel very well,
yes.
But other roses don't travel. So yeah, Graham Thomas, Gertrude Jekyll, they don't travel all that well really in different climates. So
and there's a question from Pat, who's in Wales, and this is quite relevant, I think. Is there a rain-resistant rose? Is there such a thing?
Well, yeah, I mean the singles and semi-doubles tend to be better.
Right.
With the emphasis on tend to be better.
And is that because with the bigger, the heavier the flower, the more water, and then therefore
yes,
the more damage? Yeah. Okay.
And then things like Queen of Sweden, that can resist the rain very well. And then actually one good way of doing it is if you sort of feel the petals. But if you feel the petals of different varieties, you'll feel some are much harder than others, and some are really soft and like wet tissue, and others are. So if the ones that are like wet tissue, they generally don't do very well.
Oh, interesting.
Whereas the ones with sort of harder petals tend to survive better.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Very good. Very good. And in terms of earlier on, you were talking about seeing the Rosa rugosa in Hokkaido. Is there anywhere else that you've been on your travels that has surprised you when you've seen roses flourishing, or a certain rose in a certain place? I mean, have you ever sort of thought, oh, that's a really unusual place, or been taken back by a location of a rose?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I suppose I accept them as being incredibly versatile and do well in so many different. The one that I haven't seen growing in the wild, but I'd love to, which is rather amazing, is one called Rosa clinophila, which actually grows in the floodwaters of the Brahmaputra and rivers around there, and so it spends 6 months of its year submerged below the floodwater, with just the flowers and the few leaves just sort of sitting on the surface, and then it dries out and it can grow a bit more normally. So that's quite very closely related to Rosa bracteata, the McCartney rose, which is one of the parents of mermaid. So,
right. Yes.
And where do you think rose breeding is going? I mean, you know, in 10 years' time, what are we going to be excited about?
At the moment, there's lots of interest in varieties that have been bred from Rosa persica, and persica is a Middle Eastern variety that has yellow flowers with sort of very dark, sort of dark red blotch at the base of each petal. And Jack Harkness first started breeding that in the 60s, I think it was, and introduced 2-3 varieties that were totally susceptible to black spot, because living out in the Middle East, you know, no rain, it had no use for genes to resist black spot. Of course, as soon as you brought it into UK, you know, black spot was dreadful. But over the years, and especially in the last sort of 10 years or something like that, rose breeders have been working with it and have now introduced quite a few varieties that have this dark blotch in the middle, so they're either single or semi-double. So things like Eyes for You and For Your Eyes Only. So if you see a rose with the word eyes in it, you probably.
There's one called Irish Eyes, isn't there? I know.
That's different. I think that's if I remember rightly, that's a very old. That's a variety from the I think, or maybe wrong there.
No, I mean probably, yeah.
So, but where it's going in the future, I don't know. Probably more species in the States. They've got a dreadful disease over there called rosette disease, which has sort of killed off huge numbers of roses over there. and there's no cure for it at all. So they've been trying to breed roses for resistance to that, and apparently they're having a certain amount of success, but that's going to be a very long haul. So I don't know. I think some people are searching for that blue rose, which, as you said, I hope doesn't appear.
Keep it with the blue tulip and a sort of fantasy. Yes.
Tanya's saying, I'd love to have Rosa glauca, but I would have to keep it pruned back a lot. Is there something you'd recommend doing, or should a large rose be left to get large? I mean,
yes.
Can you tame a large rose, or are you just better choosing another variety, I suppose?
Well, as I said, there's always the exception that proves the rule. So Rosa glauca, I say that species roses should not be pruned. If you start pruning the species roses, then you start ruining them. They send out great big long shoots which don't flower at all. And they've been on the planet for about 30 million years, very happy without sectors attacking them. So
yes,
plant, leave well alone. Give them plenty of space so that they don't start encroaching on the path or whatever. But Rosa glauca, because the other one that's just sort of similar sort of idea is Rosa sericea terracantha, which has the great big red thorns, which are only there on the first year stems. So those two, Rosa glauca, the beauty of that is the sort of the bluish leaves, which are lovely for a flower arranging actually. So if you cut that back on a regular basis, then you'll get some lovely fresh-looking stems, more attractive. But you won't get many flowers. So you just got to
you've got to weigh that up. Yeah,
the flowers are quite nice, and the hips are good on it actually. But so you just got to decide what you want the plant for. Whether you want fresh-looking leaves or the flowers and the hips.
Anne wants to know which rose would you choose for the best fragrance?
There's a easy answer for that. When I used to go around smelling roses with Robert Calkin, the fragrance expert, every single rose, he'd come up with a beautiful description of some sort. And actually, one of the ones that I always loved was Touch of Saison. So he described that one as, if sunshine had a fragrance, this is what it would be like.
A man with a way for words.
Yes, but actually, there's a rose an English rose that Dave Loss introduced called Buttercup. And when confronted with this, he was lost for words. He couldn't describe it except to say it's delicious fragrance, and I absolutely love that fragrance. And we've got two either side of a bench where we sit quite often. And so you can just sort of reach up and pull a flower down. And
is there a correlation between flower colour and scent or not?
Quite a few, not only very loosely. Quite of the yellows and apricots are quite fruity.
Right, I thought, I wondered if that was...
Quite a lot of the pinks have old rose fragrance. I can't think of any old rose fragrance ones that are yellow or apricot. The tea fragrance quite often find in yellow and apricot. So a very loose correlation. Really.
Right. Okay, great. And got rose gardens that you'd recommend to visit? I mean, there's Mottisfont, of course, which is
more or less purely, not quite purely old roses, mostly old roses. Very good. Wonderful one up near Middlesbrough, up north, Wynyard Hall.
Right.
Which was planted about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, maybe longer now. Which is a wonderful mix of roses and perennials in a 4-acre walled garden. That's very good. Lowther Castle, I'm going
well, and of course that beautiful plug there, Michael, because in fact on July the 21st we have an event with Michael and Dan Pearson at Lowther Castle. So the day will be split in half a little bit, a bit like Michael's garden. So Dan will be taking us around Lowther and talking about the development of Lowther. But of course, the Rose Garden will have been officially open the day before, and we will be spending the afternoon with Michael concentrating on roses. So, there are still some tickets left for that. If you haven't been to Lowther, it's just beautiful. And to spend the day with Dan and Michael, well, what's not to like about that? So, you know, that's all on the website. So do have a look in the diary pages. That's July the 21st. So yeah, that's going to be good, because the rose garden's been in for about 3 or 4 years now, has
Something
it?
like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was looking good last year, but I imagine this year it's going to really have filled out.
I think so. Yeah, it should. I'm really looking forward to coming up to see it, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's only about just next month, really.
Yes.
I think any more. I've just a couple of more questions here. No, just thank yous. And somebody who's saying found the wonderful dainty Bess at Mottisfont a few years ago. So
that was one of the parents that David Austin used for in his very first crosses, because in his first crosses he used the old roses, the old Gallicas and Damascus and Albas like that, and he crossed them with the repeat flowering roses. And he didn't want any of the characters of the hybrid teas or anything like that. He just wanted repeat flowering genes, so he just used very simple roses like that, just 5 or just a few petals. And of course they were very easy to cross with those stacks of pollen there as well. So yeah, Dainty Mace and Dusky Maiden was the other one.
Ah, right.
The red one.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. Really interesting.
Yeah, really. And I'm really looking forward to next month to meeting you at Lowther in person and learning more about the roses up there too.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to coming up.
Yeah, fantastic.
Great.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for tuning in on a lovely summer Thursday evening, or maybe Thursday lunchtime if you're in the States. And we'll see you very soon. See you next week, and maybe see some of you tomorrow at Chatsworth. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.